I remember the moment like it just happened. My name's Clara, I'm 29, and honestly, I don't know what I was thinking. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon, the kind where the day feels suspended in golden light, and everything seems soft, easy, and manageable. Julian was sitting across from me in my little apartment, leaning back on the couch, his legs stretched out in that casual way of his. A coffee cup rested precariously on the armrest, and we were talking about weekend plans. Movies, maybe a drive out to the coast, nothing too serious. It was one of those ordinary conversations that felt extraordinary, because it was with him. And then I ruined it. It started so innocently, as these things often do. We were talking about stress, how he handled it, how I handled it. Julian was recounting a frustrating moment at work, and he had this way of furrowing his brow while he thought, this quiet intensity that I'd noticed before. It struck me as familiar, painfully so. Before I could stop myself, I said it. You. No, my ex used to do the same thing. As soon as the words left my mouth, I wanted to snatch them back. The room felt different, like the air had shifted. Julian froze mid-sentence, his expression going blank. He didn't laugh, didn't roll his eyes, didn't even look at me. Instead, he just sat there, still as a statue, like he was trying to process what I had just said. I opened my mouth to say something, anything to diffuse the tension. But before I could, Julian moved. He set his coffee cup down with deliberate care, stood up, and walked toward the door. "Julian, wait," I said, my voice cracking slightly. He paused for half a second, his back still to me, but then he opened the door and stepped out, closing it behind him with a soft click that felt like a door slamming in my chest. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the door, my mind spinning. It wasn't that bad, was it? I mean, it was just a passing comment, an observation. People compare things all the time. Relationships, habits, moments. It's normal, right? But as the silence in the apartment stretched on, a sinking feeling settled in my stomach. It wasn't just about the words. It was about what they carried, the implication that I was still holding on to someone who didn't belong in this space with us. By bringing my ex into the conversation, even unintentionally, I'd made Julian feel like he wasn't enough, like he was being measured against a ghost from my past. The coffee cup on the armrest caught my eye. It still had a faint ring of steam rising from it, a testament to how recent this all was. I grabbed my phone, scrolling to Julian's name in my contacts. My thumb hovered over the call button, but I hesitated. What would I even say? That I didn't mean it? That I was sorry? That it was just a thoughtless comment, not a reflection of how I felt about him? None of it felt like enough. The hours dragged by, and with every passing minute, the weight of what I'd done grew heavier. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment over and over. I could still see the way Julian's shoulders tensed, the flicker of hurt that crossed his face before he masked it with indifference. I couldn't stop thinking about how unfair it was to him. Julian had always been patient with me, even when I didn't deserve it. He never pressured me to talk about my past, never tried to pry into the parts of me that were still raw and healing. And yet, here I was, dragging my emotional baggage into a space that should have been ours alone. By morning, I felt hollowed, out, like the regret had carved something out of me overnight. I sent Julian a message, something short and apologetic, but he didn't reply. The silence from him was deafening, a reminder of the silence in my apartment after he'd left. I spent the day pacing, alternating between checking my phone and berating myself for checking it. The longer the silence stretched on, the more I spiraled. Was this it? Had I just destroyed the best relationship I'd ever had over a careless remark? The worst part was that I couldn't even blame Julian if he walked away. Who wants to be compared to someone else, especially someone who isn't even in the picture? anymore. It wasn't fair to him, and it wasn't fair to us. By the end of the day, I felt a kind of quiet desperation settle over me. I needed to fix this, but I didn't know how. And for the first time, I realized that maybe the problem wasn't just the comment. It was everything that led up to it. All the unresolved feelings, all the fears I hadn't dealt with, all the ways I'd held back without even realizing it. I didn't know if Julian would give me the chance to explain. I didn't know if he'd want to try again. But as I sat, there in the fading light of another afternoon, I knew one thing for certain. I had to try. Because if I didn't, I would regret it for the rest of my life. I spent the next few days in a haze, waiting for Julian to respond. Each time my phone buzzed, my heart would leap, only to crash when it wasn't him. The silence was unbearable, a constant reminder of how much I'd messed up. I replayed the moment over and over, dissecting every detail, every word, every expression on his face. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how deeply my comment must have hurt him. It wasn't just a stray remark. It was a crack in the foundation of our relationship. Julian had always been his own person. Thoughtful, steady, someone who never gave me a reason to doubt him. And yet, with one careless sentence, I'd made him feel like he wasn't enough, like he was just a shadow of someone else. By the fourth day, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to do something. Anything to make things right. I drafted a message to him. Something longer this time. More heartfelt. I poured my emotions into it, explaining how sorry I was, how much I valued him, and how thoughtless my comment had been. I told him I wasn't holding on to my past, that he meant more to me than I could put into words. I read it over a dozen times before hitting send, and then I waited. Hours passed, and my stomach churned with anxiety. It wasn't just about whether he would reply. It was about whether he could forgive me. Finally, late that evening, my phone lit up with his name. My hands trembled as I opened the message. "I need some time to think," he wrote. "This isn't something I can brush off easily. I'll reach out when I'm ready." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I hadn't expected instant forgiveness, but seeing it in writing made it real. He wasn't sure if he could move past this, and I had no one to blame but myself. I sat with his message for a long time, the weight of it pressing down on me. Julian had every right to feel this way. He'd been nothing but kind and patient, and I'd hurt him. The only thing I could do now was give him the space he needed, no matter how much it hurt. The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. I threw myself into work, into errands, into anything that could distract me from the ache in my chest. But no matter what I did, the thought of Julian lingered. I kept imagining him sitting in his apartment, replaying that moment the way I had. Was he angry? Hurt? Confused? I didn't know. And it was killing me. In the quiet moments, when I couldn't distract myself anymore, I started to reflect on why I'd made that comment in the first place. It wasn't just an offhand remark. It was a symptom of something deeper. For so long, I'd been carrying the weight of my past relationship without even realizing it. My ex had left me broken, unsure of myself, and afraid to fully trust again. Even though I thought I'd moved on, the scars were still there, shaping the way I saw myself and the way I navigated my relationship with Julian. I realized I had been holding back, afraid to fully open myself up to Julian because a part of me still believed I wasn't good enough. And in some twisted way, comparing him to my ex was my subconscious trying to protect myself, keeping a barrier up so I wouldn't get hurt again. But in doing that, I'd hurt the one person who'd never given me a reason to doubt him. The realization was painful but necessary. I couldn't keep living like this, stuck in the shadow of my past. If there was any chance of salvaging things with Julian, I needed to confront these feelings head-on. That's when I decided to call Ella, my best friend. If anyone could help me make sense of this mess, it was her. When I told her what happened, she didn't sugarcoat it. "Clara, you've been carrying this baggage for years," she said. "It's no wonder it's spilling over into your relationship. But you have to decide. Are you going to keep letting your past control you, or are you going to let it go?" Her words hit me hard. She was right. I'd been letting my fear of getting hurt dictate my actions, and it was costing me the one relationship that actually felt real. By the end of our conversation, I knew what I had to do. I couldn't undo the past, but I could take responsibility for it. I needed to show Julian that I was willing to change, not just for him, but for myself. The first step was reaching out to a therapist, something I'd been putting off for years. It felt like a small step, but it was a start. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was taking control of my life instead of letting it control me. Now, all I could do was wait and hope that Julian would give me the chance to show him that I was ready to be better. Not perfect, but better. A week passed before I heard from Julian again. It felt like an eternity. Each day without him was a constant tug of war between hope and despair, but I forced myself to stay busy. Therapy had been a surprisingly grounding experience, even in its early days. Talking to someone about the tangled mess of my past brought a strange sense of relief, like I was finally unpacking a suitcase I'd been carrying for far too long. And then, one evening, just as I was about to give up hope, my phone buzzed. His name lit up the screen, and my heart stopped. His message was simple. "Can we talk? Tomorrow night at my place?" I stared at the words for a long moment, my chest tightening. This was it. The moment I'd been waiting for, dreading, and hoping for all at once. I typed back a quick, "Yes, of course," and set my phone down, my mind racing. The next day was a blur. I replayed every possible scenario in my head, what he might say, what I should say. By the time I arrived at his apartment, my nerves were frayed. I knocked on the door, and when Julian opened it, my breath caught. He looked tired. Not in a physical sense, but emotionally, like he'd been carrying something heavy. He stepped aside to let me in, and we settled into the living room. The air between us felt thick, weighted with everything unspoken. "I'm glad you came," he said after a long pause. "Thank you for asking me to," I replied, my voice softer than I intended. Julian leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped together. "Clara, I've had a lot of time to think about what happened," he began, "and I need you to know how much that comment hurt. It wasn't just what you said, it was what it made me feel, like I'm not my own person to you, like I'll always be compared to someone else." His words cut deep, but I didn't interrupt. He deserved to be heard. "I've been nothing but myself with you, and I thought you saw that," he continued. "But when you said that, it made me wonder if you were really with me, or if I was just filling a space someone else left behind." Tears stung my eyes, but I blinked them away. "Julian, I'm so sorry," I said, my voice trembling. "You're right. What I said was unfair, and it wasn't about you at all. It was about me, about my past and how I've let it define me for far too long. I didn't realize how much I was holding on to until that moment, and it's something I'm working on now. I'm seeing a therapist, trying to untangle all the things I've been carrying." His eyes softened slightly, but he didn't respond right away. The silence stretched, and I felt the urge to fill it. "You have every right to feel hurt," I added. "And I understand if you can't forgive me, but I want you to know that I see you, Julian. For who you are, not for who you remind me of. And I don't want to lose you." He leaned back, exhaling deeply. Clara, I care about you. A lot. But this can't happen again. I need to feel like I'm enough for you, like you're here with me, not stuck in the past. If we're going to move forward, there have to be boundaries. I'm willing to try, but only if you are too. I am, I said quickly, nodding. More than anything. For the first time that night, a small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give me hope. We talked for hours after that, laying everything out on the table. It was raw, uncomfortable, and emotional, but it also felt like a fresh start. Julian wasn't offering me an easy way out. He was offering me a chance to rebuild, brick by brick, if I was willing to put in the work. When I left his apartment that night, the air between us felt lighter. There was still so much to navigate, so much to prove, but for the first time in days, I felt like we had a chance. As I walked home, I replayed his words in my mind. He was right. If this was going to work, I had to be fully present with him. And for the first time, I felt ready to let go of the past and take that step forward. In the days that followed, Julian and I found ourselves treading carefully, like we were both learning how to walk on unfamiliar terrain. Our conversations were a little slower, a little more deliberate, but there was also a sincerity to them that hadn't been there before. It was as though the tension from that night had stripped away some of the pretense we didn't even realize we'd been holding on to. I kept going to therapy, and though the sessions were emotionally draining, they were also enlightening. I started unpacking not just my previous relationship, but the ways I'd internalized the hurt and let it shape how I approached love. My therapist helped me see patterns I hadn't recognized, how I'd held people at arm's length, how I'd second-guessed myself, how I'd let fear masquerade as caution. One session in particular stood out. My therapist, a calm and unflappable woman named Diane, asked me a simple question. What do you believe Julian deserves from you? The question lingered in my mind long after the session ended. It wasn't about what I wanted to give or what I thought I was capable of. It was about what he deserved. And the answer was clear. He deserved my honesty, my trust, and my full presence. If I couldn't offer him those things, then I didn't deserve him. That realization was sobering but also empowering. It gave me a clearer sense of purpose, a reason to keep working on myself, not just for Julian, but for me. Our relationship wasn't magically fixed overnight, of course. There were moments of awkwardness, moments where I felt the weight of my past creeping back in. But instead of ignoring it, I started talking about it, with Julian, with Diane, with myself. The more I opened up, the lighter I felt. One evening, about a month after the incident, Julian and I were cooking dinner together in my kitchen. It was one of those quiet, unremarkable nights, the kind that felt like a balm for my soul. As he chopped vegetables and I stirred a pot of pasta, I found myself smiling at him, watching the way the light caught the angles of his face. "What?" he asked, catching me staring. I hesitated, then put down the spoon. I want to thank you, I said. He raised an eyebrow, setting the knife down. For what? For giving me another chance, for being patient, for sticking with me even when I didn't deserve it, I said, my voice wavering slightly. I know I hurt you, and I'll probably spend the rest of my life trying to make up for that. But I need you to know that I'm all in now. No comparisons, no holding back. Just us. For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then, he reached out and brushed a strand of hair from my face. I believe you, he said softly. And I'm all in too. The relief that washed over me was overwhelming. For the first time, I felt like we were truly on the same page, like we were building something real and solid together. As the weeks turned into months, we grew stronger. We learned to communicate better, to navigate each other's quirks and vulnerabilities with compassion. And while I couldn't erase the mistake I'd made, I realized that it didn't have to define us. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, Julian reached for my hand. "You know," he said, a teasing smile playing on his lips, "I've been meaning to tell you. Your pasta game has really improved." I laughed, nudging him with my shoulder. "Oh, so you were just tolerating my cooking before?" "Maybe," he said, grinning. Then his expression softened. "But seriously, Clara, I'm proud of you, of us. We've come a long way." His words brought tears to my eyes, but this time they were happy tears. "Yeah," I said, squeezing his hand. "We really have." And in that moment, I realized that while I couldn't change the past, I had the power to shape the future. Together, we were stronger, not because we were perfect, but because we were willing to grow. Months passed, and Julian and I found a rhythm that felt steady and genuine. There were no grand declarations, no sweeping moments of cinematic perfection, just a series of small, quiet victories that reminded me love wasn't about being flawless. It was about showing up, even when it was hard. Our conversations deepened, not just about our relationship, but about everything, our childhoods, our fears, our dreams. I learned things about Julian I hadn't known before, like how he used to draw comic book characters as a kid, or how he'd once spent an entire summer trying to learn the guitar only to give up when he realized his fingers weren't quite coordinated enough. And he learned more about me, too. I told him stories I'd never shared with anyone else, about the time I got lost at a carnival when I was 8, or how I used to write poems in secret but stopped, because I didn't think I was any good. He never judged me, never made me feel small for the things I'd kept hidden. Instead, he encouraged me, made me feel seen in a way I hadn't thought possible. But the real test came one afternoon when we decided to tackle a home project together, painting the walls of his apartment. It sounded simple enough, but within an hour, we were both covered in paint and laughing at our complete lack of coordination. "You missed a spot," Julian said, pointing to a patch of unpainted wall above my head. "Of course I did," I replied, reaching up with the roller and accidentally splattering paint onto his shirt. He looked down at the stain, then back at me, his expression mock-serious. "You realize this means war." Before I could react, he dipped his finger into the paint can and swiped it across my cheek. I gasped, grabbing a brush and retaliating with a streak of paint across his arm. What followed was less of a painting session and more of a chaotic, impromptu paint fight. By the end, the walls were only half finished, and we were both sitting on the floor, breathless and laughing. "I don't think this is what they mean by teamwork," I said, wiping paint off my hands. "Maybe not," Julian said, grinning. "But it's a lot more fun." As I looked at him, his hair slightly mussed, his shirt streaked with paint, I felt a warmth spread through me. This was the kind of moment I'd been afraid of before. Not perfect, not planned, just messy and real. And yet, it was exactly what I wanted. Later that evening, as we cleaned up the mess we'd made, I caught myself thinking about how far we'd come. There were still moments when my old insecurities tried to creep in, but they didn't control me anymore. I'd learned to recognize them for what they were, echoes of a past I was no longer living in. Julian had taught me that love wasn't about erasing your scars, but about learning to live with them, together. And I'd taught myself that I was capable of growth, of letting go of the things that had weighed me down for so long. That night, as we sat on the couch with takeout boxes balanced on our laps, Julian turned to me. "I've been thinking," he said, his tone serious. "Oh no," I teased. "That's dangerous." He chuckled, but then grew quiet, his gaze steady. "I just wanted to say, I'm proud of us. Not just for sticking it out, but for doing the work, for trying. I don't think I've ever had that in a relationship before." His words hit me in a way I didn't expect, and I reached for his hand. Me neither, I admitted. But I'm glad we're here. With you, it feels worth it. He smiled, squeezing my hand. It is. In that moment, I realized we'd found something rare. Not perfection, but progress. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. A year later, on an unseasonably warm autumn afternoon, Julian and I stood in a park near his apartment, surrounded by the reds and golds of falling leaves. We weren't there for any special reason, just a spontaneous outing to soak up the last warmth before winter. We strolled along the path, sipping coffee from paper cups and talking about everything and nothing. His plans for a new project at work, my latest therapy breakthrough, where we should go for dinner. It was the kind of effortless, flowing conversation I'd come to cherish. As we rounded a bend in the path, Julian suddenly stopped walking. I turned to look at him, surprised. His expression was serious, but there was a softness in his eyes that made my heart skip a beat. "Clara," he said, setting his coffee cup on a nearby bench. "There's something I've been wanting to say." I felt a flutter of nerves. "What is it?" He took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair. "This past year has been transformative. Not just for us as a couple, but for me as a person. You've challenged me, supported me, and made me feel like I could be myself without holding anything back. And I hope I've done the same for you." "You have," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "Good, because I want to keep doing that. I want to keep showing up for you, and I want us to keep growing together. Clara, I love you, more than I've ever loved anyone." My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't the first time he'd said those words, but something about this moment felt different. It felt like a promise, like a vow. "I love you too," I said, tears welling in my eyes. Julian reached for my hands, his grip firm and steady. "Then let's keep building this. Whatever the future looks like, I want us to face it together. No comparisons, no holding back. Just us." His words hit me with the weight of everything we'd been through, every mistake, every moment of growth, every step we'd taken toward healing. "I want that too," I said, my voice shaking with emotion. "With you, it feels possible. It feels right." We stood there for a long moment, wrapped in the warmth of each other's presence. The world around us seemed to fade away, leaving only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the steady rhythm of our breathing. As we continued walking, hand in hand, I couldn't help but reflect on how far we'd come. The woman I'd been a year ago, the one who let her past define her, who compared and doubted and held back, felt like a distant memory. I'd made peace with her, learned from her, but I no longer carried her burdens. Julian and I weren't perfect, and we never would be. But we didn't need to be. What mattered was that we chose each other every day, that we faced our flaws and fears head on, and that we did the work to keep growing. Love, I realized, wasn't about finding someone who fixed you or completed you. It was about finding someone who walked beside you as you became the best version of yourself, and doing the same for them. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the horizon in shades of orange and pink, I felt a sense of peace I'd never known before. Julian squeezed my hand, and I looked up at him, smiling. Whatever came next, we'd face it together. And that was enough. As winter settled in, Julian and I found ourselves falling into a new rhythm. The world outside grew colder, but our relationship felt warmer than ever. We spent evenings curled up on the couch, binge-watching shows and debating plot twists. Weekends were filled with shared projects, long walks, and the occasional misadventure, like the time we tried to bake a holiday pie from scratch and ended up with something resembling a science experiment gone wrong. One snowy afternoon, as I sifted through an old box of keepsakes, I came across a photo of my ex. It wasn't anything significant, a group picture from a party years ago, but it caught me off guard. For a moment, I felt a pang of guilt, as though the very act of seeing his face might undo all the progress I'd made. But then I realized something that surprised me. I didn't feel the familiar sting of pain or regret. I didn't feel anything, really. Just a distant acknowledgement of someone who had once been a part of my life. It wasn't bitterness or longing, just a quiet neutrality. That evening, as Julian and I decorated our tiny Christmas tree, I told him about the photo. "I found it earlier today," I said, handing him an ornament shaped like a snowflake. And for the first time, I didn't feel weighed down by it. I just thought, oh, there's a chapter that's over, and moved on. Julian placed the ornament carefully on a branch, then turned to me with a soft smile. "That's progress," he said. "It means you're letting go." I nodded, feeling a swell of gratitude. It feels like it. And I think it's because of us. Because you've shown me what it means to really move forward. He reached for my hand, pulling me closer. "I think we've shown each other," he said, his voice steady. "You've taught me so much, about patience and vulnerability, about what it means to love someone fully. I'm better because of you." Tears welled in my eyes, but this time they were tears of joy. "I don't know what I did to deserve you," I whispered. Julian chuckled, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "You don't have to deserve me, Clara. We deserve each other." As the tree lights flickered and the room filled with the faint scent of pine, I felt a deep sense of peace. The ghosts of my past no longer loomed over me. They had been replaced by the steady, unwavering presence of someone who truly saw me for who I was. That night, as we sat by the fire, Julian wrapped his arm around me, and I rested my head on his shoulder. "What do you think our next adventure will be?" I asked, my voice soft. He tilted his head, pretending to ponder. "Probably something involving more paint or disastrous baking attempts," he joked. I laughed, nudging him playfully. "I mean it. Where do you see us in the future?" Julian's expression grew thoughtful. "Honestly, I see us right here, together. No matter where we go or what we do, as long as we're side by side, I think we'll be okay." His words settled over me like a warm blanket, and I realized he was right. The specifics of our future didn't matter as much as the fact that we'd face it together. The journey we'd taken over the past year hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every tear, every doubt, every hard conversation. We weren't perfect, but we were real, and that was enough. As the fire crackled and the snow fell softly outside, I closed my eyes and let myself savor the moment. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of the future. Whatever came next, we'd handle it together. And that was all I needed. Winter turned to spring, and the world around us came alive again. Julian and I had fallen into a rhythm that felt less like something we were striving for, and more like something we simply were. The past no longer loomed over us. It had faded into the background, a part of our story, but no longer the defining chapter. One Saturday morning, as sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, we found ourselves standing side by side, making pancakes. Julian was humming to himself as he flipped a perfectly golden pancake onto a plate. I was on syrup duty, carefully measuring the amount he always teased me for overpouring. "Do you think we'll ever get tired of this?" I asked, gesturing to the mundane domesticity of it all. Julian turned to me with a grin. "If we do, I'll just find a new way to make you laugh." I rolled my eyes, but I couldn't suppress the smile that crept across my face. You're too smooth for your own good, you know that? Maybe, he said, setting down the spatula and wrapping his arms around me. But it worked, didn't it? I laughed, leaning into him. Moments like this were what I'd once feared I'd never have. Moments of quiet, unshakable love. It wasn't the grand gestures or the dramatic declarations that made us strong. It was this. The day-to-day choosing of each other, the small acts of care that built a foundation so sturdy it felt unbreakable. As we sat down to eat, Julian reached for my hand across the table. Clara, I know we've said this before, but I want to say it again. Thank you. For choosing me. For choosing us, even when it was hard. And I squeezed his hand, my heart full. Thank you for giving me the chance to. You've shown me what love really looks like, Julian. I didn't think I'd ever find it, but here we are. Here we are, he echoed, smiling. And as I looked at him, I realized I wasn't just in love. I was home. Julian had become my safe place, my partner, my everything. And while our journey hadn't been perfect, it had been ours. The rest of the day unfolded like so many others, simple, beautiful, and entirely ours. The weight of my past was gone, replaced by the warmth of a future we were building together. Love wasn't about erasing scars. It was about holding someone's hand and saying, I see you, all of you, and I choose you anyway. That's what Julian and I had found. And that's what we'd keep choosing every single day. If this story moved you, let us know with a like or comment. And if you've ever experienced something similar, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you for reading. Your time means the world.